time again. Getting down there. Getting down to the end. With chapter 20. Nick lay in his bed, his eyes locked on the ceiling. They were strained, puffy, and it felt like they were filled with sand every time he blinked. His mind continued to grasp, the image refusing to go away. The imprint hovered on the edge of his every thought, of Jason floating in the pool face down, his blood dyeing the water, the ghastly wound releasing what was left of his life. No matter what he did, Nick couldn't rid himself of the image. He didn't think he'd slept, though he couldn't be sure. Perhaps there were moments mixed into the dreariness of lying in bed. If he had, he felt sure nightmares would be waiting for him. The scene at the pool came back even more vividly than when he closed his eyes, so he did everything he could to keep them open. Nick rolled to his side, trying to find a more comfortable position. His back felt sore from laying down for so long. He debated getting up and walking around, but thought better of it. He also thought about food, though he should be hungry. Thought he should be hungry. Normally he couldn't go more than 4 hours without hunger entering his mind. Now he hadn't eaten in 3 days. His stomach made strange noises from time to time. Even so, there was no desire to eat. The bloody pool flashed back into his thoughts, making him wince. Ugh, he moaned, grabbing a pillow and pulling it over his face. It wasn't right. Nothing seemed right. His world had been blown up at that moment watching Jason. How could it be so dark? How could things get so bad? How could they get that bad? He had seen blood and gore in movies, heard about war, people getting into car accidents, but to witness such horrible death firsthand, it shifted his entire view of reality. Those things, those nasty, horrible things, they were real, and they happened. How could people celebrate or bring children into a world like this? Nick pulled the pillow tighter and moaned. It would be another day before Nick finally left his house. He didn't want to get up, but he felt he had to. It was the day of Jason's funeral, and he knew he couldn't miss it. He wasn't sure if he could drive or not, so he ordered a lift. 15 minutes later, he was on his way. The funeral was taking place at a large Catholic church about 7 miles away. Nick got there early, but was still surprised to find the parking lot empty. Hang in there, the Lyft driver said in parting. It'll get better. Thanks, Nick replied. He had to wonder how distraught he looked to receive such a statement from a stranger who had no idea what he was going through. Or perhaps he watched YouTube and knew exactly what was going on. The fog in his mind wouldn't allow him to ponder on it much further. It was hard to think about anything beyond the dark images in his mind. He shut the door behind himself, and the Lyft driver pulled away. A breeze blew through the parking lot, and 2 small birds hopped across the empty spaces. Nick watched them as he walked along, his dress shoes tapping against the pavement. He felt jealous. The birds had no idea what kind of a place they lived in. To them, everything seemed innocent. They flew around without care. He became so distracted that he almost walked face first into the doors of the church. Only a last-second shuffle avoided the collision. Nick stepped inside, passing a cross-filled lobby and entering the large cathedral beyond. The clicking of his feet sounded louder in here, echoing through the still air. Arching beams crisscrossed over the high ceiling, reaching up from rows of rectangular stained glass windows. Long pews stretched from each side of the main aisle, and it smelled of incense. A priest in black clothes acknowledged him as he walked along. None of that held Nick's attention, for his eyes were locked on the casket at the end of the aisle. He took a deep breath, then doubled his stride until he reached it. There he stood, looking down and wondering what he should do. It was a closed casket, so he couldn't see anything beyond the ornately carved wood. He placed his hand near the top half. "I'm sorry I didn't realize," he whispered. "Sorry I didn't get there faster." Inwardly, he thought, "I'm sorry I didn't think to save your camera, that I let it sit at the bottom of that pool until your final message to the world decayed. I wish I was stronger," he continued. "I would have put an end to the entire affair with Daisy before it even began." He let his hand fall, then went and sat in a pew. He thought more people should show that he had merely been early. In the end, the only other person to come in was an old man who sat in one of the back pews. When it became clear no one else was coming, the priest came up in front of the casket and began to give his sermon. Nick tried to listen to the man, but his own thoughts kept overpowering his ability to concentrate. He wondered what footage was on that camera that had fallen into the pool. Jason's final message. Had he called on the world for forgiveness? To condemn their cruelty? Perhaps it had been to Daisy, a farewell to a lover. He would never know. The water had seen to that. His attention drew back to the preacher as he waved a brush over the casket. He used it to splash what Nick could only guess was holy water. When he finished, he turned to the empty church and said, "If anyone would like to say a few words, please come up front and do so now." The old man didn't move, and Nick knew there was no one else. He knew he couldn't let Jason be buried without a word. He would have to say something, even if he didn't know what. Nick stood and began walking, feeling a spike in adrenaline, despite the fact no one was there to watch. He approached the priest and was directed to a podium a little ways to the right. There he stood before a microphone. "Hello," he said, his voice echoing back from speakers placed throughout the cathedral. "I had the pleasure of getting to know Jason over the past year, as he became one of my best friends." His voice cracked, and he set himself to fight off any emotion that crept in. Jason was a special person. He had a light that made everybody want to be near him. If they couldn't, they would flock to his videos, if only to feel as though they could for a few minutes. Jason was kind and would do anything for others. All he wanted in return was love. Nick gripped the podium tight and closed his eyes, willing the pain away from his throat. "We didn't deserve him." He let his words trail off, looking over at the casket, then said, "I love you, Jason. I'm gonna miss you." He waited a moment until he decided he didn't have anything else to say. When he felt sure he didn't, he took a hard breath, then stepped away from the mic. As he left the podium, the preacher gestured across the empty pews. "At this time, if you would like to confer amongst yourselves, please do so," he said, then walked to the side. Nick settled back down into his seat. The act of giving the speech, giving Jason something, had lifted the fog a little. It was the first moment of improvement he felt since the pool. "Thank you," said a deep male voice. Nick looked up to see the old man had come to him from the back pew. "That was a nice speech," he went on. I feel better knowing my boy had you. He tapped the pew, then moved on towards the casket. Not knowing what to say in return, Nick just nodded. The realization that the old man was Jason's dad was not lost on him. He felt sorry that the guy had to see the empty pews and cursed everyone for leaving them empty. Except they no longer were completely empty. A figure in the back caught Nick's eye. A man with a full beard down to his chest, large sunglasses, and a gray coat entered into the building. Nick's immediate reaction was one of relief, if anything for the old man's sake. The man stopped at the end of the pews and surveyed the church. He waited another 30 seconds, then lifted a camera and started recording. Nick jumped to his feet at the sight of this and marched down the aisle towards him. "Can I help you?" he asked. Now that he stood closer, he could see the man was in his mid to late 40s. He had a looping nose ring that didn't fit with someone his age. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's the great Nick Alltheway," said the man, turning the camera towards him. "Welcome to the Dan Cody vlog. Can I get a quote?" Nick blinked in stunned bafflement. "You're what?" "I'm here to record this historical event." Nick stared into the camera lens, and it stared back, a never-blinking eye. "You need to leave," said Nick. He could feel his rage beginning to rise. "What?" said the man, laughing as he did so. Before he could even realize what he was doing, Nick shoved him. "Leave," he repeated. The man fought for his balance, then re-centered, his camera on Nick. "Hey," he complained, "I said get out of here." This time Nick shouted and shoved so hard that the man fell to the ground. Still steadying the camera with one hand, the man looked frightened as he scrambled back to his feet. He retreated towards the front doors. Nick followed and shoved again. This time the man managed not to fall. "I have you on camera," the now red-faced man complained. "Good," said Nick, shoving him so hard that he went right through the front doors of the church. "Go viral and piss off." He thought the guy might turn around and try to get back in, but to his surprise, he didn't. Instead, he alternated filming Nick at the door and turning the camera around to film himself. He continued to retreat until he moved beyond the parking lot and headed down the sidewalk. Nick stood guard for another minute until he felt sure the guy wasn't coming back. Then he went back to his pew. It was another hour before church staff helped Nick and Jason's dad load the casket into the hearse and begin driving to the cemetery. Not having a vehicle, Jason's dad gave Nick a ride in his old blue truck. When they set off, they were a motorcade of one. "He was a hard worker, my son," said Jason's dad once they were on the road. Even when he was little, Nick shifted in his seat, watching the hearse out the front window, out in front of them. "I know," he half whispered. "I could take him into the field with me, and he would go all day long if I asked." Even when he was a kid? Oh yeah, he would work hard the whole time too. Had calluses on his hands just like any of the old men. He bowed his head, and his voice grew low. "But this is no life out here. They killed my boy's spirit." Unsure of how to respond, Nick said, "It was a tragedy." "No," replied Jason's dad. "It was this place. People were never meant to live like this." "Jason built a social media empire," said Nick, "and he died alone." He pounded his hand on the steering wheel. Nick didn't know what to say, so he nodded. Jason's dad continued, I seen it plenty. If you don't leave this place, you'll die alone too. The steering wheel squeaked as he twisted his palms against it. Nick watched Skid Row going by outside, as if to emphasize his words. You can't run from the internet, said Nick. No, said Jason's dad. But right now, your whole life revolves around it, and it's not even real. Nick sank a little in his seat, listening to the pebbles as they rattled against the floorboards. You have to chase tangible things, Jason's dad said after a short pause. Things you can touch, things you can smell. If the internet has to be there, let it be in the background. Don't let a bunch of strangers run your life. Yeah, Nick agreed, though he wasn't entirely sure. He knew what the man was saying. Workers were waiting at the cemetery to help them unload the casket. They waited in the background as the preacher gave his last words. Nick said his final goodbye, then put his hand on the cool casket for the final time. When he walked away, he didn't look back. He could hear the crank behind him as they lowered his friend into the ground. It was slow and sad. He felt glad to be moving away. He wanted to ask Jason's dad for a ride home, but thought better of it and called a Lyft. His Lyft driver was a red-haired man in a bedazzled shirt. He recognized Nick, saying, "You're the dude from YouTube." His excited and happy mood contrasted how Nick felt, so much that it was hard for him to take. "Yeah," Nick replied, forcing a smile. "Oh man, my roommate and I watch your stuff," said the driver as he put the car in drive. "Dude, I can't believe I got to drive you." "I'm nobody," Nick insisted. This made the driver laugh. "Yeah, right. You guys are basically the #1 show in America, if you can call YouTube videos a show." Nick slid a little closer to the back door, retreating away as far as he could. The driver continued to rant, asking a string of questions that Nick answered with polite yeahs and uh-huhs. He answered on autopilot, focusing more on the clouds in the sky than on the driver. It wasn't until the driver said, "Holy crap, the whole Dandy Squad is here," that he regained Nick's attention. Nick turned away from his window to look out the front. They were pulling up to his house, out front. There were 3 sports cars and an old refurbished Bronco. The drivers and their passengers were all loitering around their vehicles. Sure enough, it was almost the entire Dandy Squad. "Oh man, no one's ever going to believe this," said the Uber driver as he pulled out his phone and began bouncing in his seat. "Can I be in a video?" Nick opened his door and climbed out of the car. "It was nice meeting you," he said, closing the door behind him. As he began walking towards the Dandy Squad, he could see out of the corner of his eye that the Lyft driver wasn't leaving. Instead, he took a video of everyone. Whoops, there's a typo. I want Lyft, Uber, Lyft. Anyway, he took a video of everyone. Okay. Erickson moved out from the vehicle when he saw Nick. "Hey man, we've been waiting for you." "For what?" asked Nick. "Our channels have all taken a huge hit since the incident, and it's beginning to impact our lives. We've all been talking and decided the best course of action would be to choose a new leader, someone that can show we've moved on." Erickson blurted in a rush, as though reciting a practice speech. "That must be so hard on you," said Nick. Erickson went on. "We've all talked it over and decided we want you to be the one to lead us." "Me?" asked Nick. "Yeah, you were always Jason's #2, and you have the biggest channel out of all of us. Who better?" Nick thought about the funeral, about the empty pews, all of the people in the front of his house, the entire dandy squad. They weren't there. They hadn't had the common decency to pay respect to the man that had given them everything. Would they do the same to him? Jason's dad had told him to run. In that moment, Nick knew exactly what he was talking about. "Pass," said Nick, then continued walking towards his house. "What?" Erickson called after him. "You're just gonna abandon us?" Nick shrugged. "I think you'll survive." "After everything?" "Oh yeah," said Nick. "Definitely after everything." Erickson threw his arms up in confused frustration. Nick ignored him and walked through his front door. He locked it in case any of them wanted to try and come in. None of them did, and a few minutes later, he heard their vehicles firing up and pulling away. He hoped it was the last he would hear from them. Nick plopped down on his couch and kicked his feet onto the table. He decided he was done with this place, done with the people and everything about it. It was time for him to make a change. He just had to figure out what that was. The sad funeral. Tough days, tough days. But onward and upward. Next time, in the final chapter.